So today we are going to start World War II. This is video 1 of 3. We're going to start out today looking at how the United States shifted from neutrality or isolationism of the 1930s into involvement during the war with Pearl Harbor. So the focus question for this video, you should be able to answer this question at the end, is how and why U.S. foreign policy changed from neutrality to total involvement. And so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to start in Asia, and we're going to talk about Japanese aggression. So to provide some context for this situation, remember that Secretary of State Hay, back when we were talking about imperialism, he issued his open door notes where we had been trading with China freely and kind of encouraged other countries to do so. And Japan was beginning to ignore that policy. And basically what they do is they invade Manchuria in September of 1931. Which I think is important to note, that a lot of people think that World War II started when Germany invaded Poland in 1939. But it's very important that we remember what the Japanese government and army did to the Chinese people as early as 1931. Now, during this time, the League of Nations did not take any action. So to provide more context for that, remember that the United States never joined the League of Nations. We were worried about our sovereignty. We were worried about the ability to declare war. And so we were not a part of that. So it's mostly European nations, all of which are extremely nervous about getting involved in another war. And so we'll be talking about appeasement later. And so they say nothing about Japanese aggression. They pass a resolution that kind of condemns it, but after that, nothing really happens. The League fails to maintain that peace. Japanese walk out on the League of Nations. The United States refuses to recognize the Japanese regime. But still, again, it's kind of like a little slap on the hand, not anything that really prevents the Japanese from pursuing that form of aggression. Now, FDR's foreign policy during the Great Depression, as you can imagine, more contextualization for the 1930s and our isolationism is the Great Depression. Our number one concern is the economy and the New Deal programs. We are not that worried about, at least in the early 1930s, about what's going on in world affairs. Now, in his first inaugural address, he does issue his good neighbor policy, right, towards other nations in the Western Hemisphere. What he's trying to do is kind of fix some of those imperialistic administrations, like what the damage that they did, especially in Latin America, like Teddy Roosevelt, Taft with dollar diplomacy, Wilson with like issues with Mexico. And so FDR is trying to cooperate with Latin American countries, mostly to try and prevent the rise of some sort of militaristic regime like what is going on in Europe. This is going to be kind of similar to the Cold War in that we really try to influence ourselves in South America in order to prevent the spread of communism. The Pan American Conference in 1933 and in 1936, they're trying to undo a lot of the problems that Teddy Roosevelt started. So like with Panama or Colombia, issues with them. And then FDR ends up persuading Congress, thankfully, to nullify the Platt Amendment in Cuba. So even though we kept Guantanamo Bay, we did not, let me get this out of there for you. We kept the right to Guantanamo Bay. However, that we gave them a little bit more political freedoms. So in 1933, due to economic reasons, FDR recognizes the Soviet Union. Before that, Republican presidents had kind of refused to do so. This will also be similar to once China falls to communism. The United States will refuse to accept the People's Republic of China as like in opposition up until when Nixon actually says this is silly, we need to trade with China. So it's mostly out of economic reasoning, even though they are communist nations. In the Philippines, it was getting too expensive, so we start kind of looking at gradual removal of U.S. troops. They will have their independence by 1946. And we're trying to increase trade. They lower tariffs by 50%. And the goal was that they would reciprocate and that they would reduce tariffs for U.S. imports. So we're trying to increase global trade. Remember that one of the reasons that global trade went down so much was because of the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act. And that was something done by under the Hoover administration in an attempt to try and help the U.S. economy. But what it did is it actually sank everyone deeper into the Great Depression. Now, let's look over in Europe. So the first thing we need to talk about is that the worldwide depression of the 1930s and even the effects of World War I in the 1920s, it's having a major impact on Europe. And so what it allowed to create is people kind of in a desperate position, a rise in nationalism and resentment after World War I. They are angry about the economic depression, and it allowed for these military dictators to develop in Italy in the 1920s and in Japan and Germany in the 1930s. By 1940, Germany, Italy, and Japan had signed an alliance treaty, and that was called the Axis Powers. So in Italy, you have Mussolini. He was had a fascist regime, and you've probably heard the word fascism. And fascism is kind of it's kind of a difficult thing to kind of understand for a lot of people, like exactly what it is. The first thing you need to know is that it is mostly about nationalism. The people need to do whatever it takes in order to glorify their nation and their race, right? And it's typically used by aggressive show of force, so it's typically militaristic. It has also been historically very conservative, far right on the spectrum. They hate communists, they hate socialism. It attracted a lot of war veterans and those afraid of communism. And in Italy, in particular, Mussolini's followers were called black shirts. And in Germany, you have the rise of the Nazi Party in the 1920s. You have hyperinflation in Germany because of those war reparations from World War I after the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler, charismatic speaker, really appealed to the fears of the German people, their lack of money, their lack of basic commodities, and really used the Jewish population of Germany and Poland, right? So they're going to target the Poles as like they are the cause of this, and they are like kind of the root of all evil, and like they're these less desirables, and these are the people you need to be angry at someone. This is who you need to be angry at, and kind of listed all these people, the Jews being one of them. And you guys should remember this from World War II. His followers are called the brown shirts. And by 1933, the Nazi Party has complete control over the legislature, and they are in control. And for the most part, people are supporting him willingly. And that's very important to understand, is that there were people that were in opposition, but remember, as a part of these fascist governments, if you speak out against the government, your life is threatened. And so that's important to remember as well. In Japan, again, they have a rise of nationalism and militarism. In particular, they convinced their emperor that they had to expand their borders in order, in particular with China, in order to for raw materials. So this is kind of what you saw, like why people were looking for, like turning to imperialism at the turn of the century, as they're looking for raw materials, or even like during colonization. But this is also like has a political motive as well. All right, but meanwhile, back in the United States, most Americans are isolationists. They see what's going on and they really don't care. Most people want to stay out of it. They want to let the European countries kind of deal with it themselves. Most isolationists are going to be in the Midwest and among Republicans, which is interesting because during the imperialism, when we were talking about American imperialism, it was Republicans that were interested in pursuing foreign political relations, right, and imperialist policies. Now it's the opposite, and the root of that is their economic motives. So during imperialism, they are wanting to expand their economies, right, across the border. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, they want nothing to do with it because it's not going to benefit them economically at this point. Their number one focus was on the economy, especially when you think about these New Deal policies and the role of the government and the regulations that are being put in place during the 1930s. Those are the things that they wanted to focus on. Remember how much power that unions got and the working class and labor. Think about, the Wagner Act and the Fair Labor Standards. And so looking at minimum wage and working hours. There's a lot of regulation coming in on these businesses during the 1930s. And so that was their number one priority because all of that was unprecedented. A lot of people also reference World War I. They believe that it was a mistake. They believed that it was motivated by business interests, right? Arms manufacturers, bankers. Think about how much money they made during that time period. Gerald Nye, a U.S. senator, was the one that led the committee in investigating that. And not overwhelming evidence can connect it, but you can kind of imagine that Republicans had the majority in Congress at that time. Most of the Republicans had foreign assets and investments in some of those sugarcane plantations, especially starting with the Spanish-American War. So you can kind of connect the dots. Where there's smoke, there's fire. But a lot of people believed that and wanted nothing to do with it. Now, in order to prevent future involvement in the war, and this is important for your quiz. So you have a series of neutrality acts. For your quiz, you will only have to put the neutrality acts, okay? So I'll phrase the question where it says, to ensure U.S. policy would be neutral if war broke out in Europe, Congress passed the neutrality acts. And that would be your answer. So basically looking at a lot of the causes of World War I, you have prohibiting shipment of arms, right? So during World War I, how this was different is that we were like, oh, economically, we'll do whatever we want, but we ended up just trading with the Allies because of the British blockade on the Germans, and that led to U-boats and unrestricted submarine warfare, and that became an issue with Germany, and so we kind of got drawn into it. And so here, we don't want anything to do with that. If there's a country that's at war, we're not loaning them money, we're not giving them any type of line of credit. We don't want Americans going there. It also prevented, so during this time that there was the Civil War in Spain, we decided early on that we weren't going to play any role in that as well. And you also had the America First Committee. These are isolations that are a little worried about FDR, because I'm going to get to this in a second, but they're a little worried about his pro-British policies. And I'll back FDR up a little bit here. But again, they are trying to persuade public opinion against war. One of the most outspoken critics of war and FDR at this time was Charles Lindbergh, who was a big celebrity, in the 1920s. So, between 1935 and 1938, fascist dictators start to take advantage of British and French appeasement. Appeasement means that they were letting Germany and Italy and Japan kind of take advantage of them a little bit, right? So they would have this small act of aggression, and then they would just like say, oh, well, just please don't do that again. Or they would kind of say like, oh, we're gonna pass this sanction on you, but they never really followed through with anything. I like to think of appeasement. I always give the analogy of if your parents give you a curfew and you come in past the curfew, but they don't punish you in any type of way, and you're like, so the next weekend when you're going out, you're like, well, they're not going to punish me, so I'm just going to do it again. That's the thing, right? So Germany and Italy are taking advantage of them. They are pushing the boundaries. They're seeing how much they can get away with it. Meanwhile, the United States is kind of going along with it because of isolationist support. Italy invades Ethiopia. That's number one thing that happens that kind of kicks all of this off. But really what we're worried about for the most part is Germany. So in 1936, they invade the Rhineland. And it's part of Western Germany. It's supposed to be demilitarized after Versailles. And he openly defies that and occupies the region. And Britain and France, the League of Nations, they don't do anything. They're like, oh, please don't do that, right? So they're kind of, again, letting him take advantage of their weakness. So what is their weakness? They don't want to go back to war. Their economy was destroyed after the war, in addition to a Great Depression. And so they want to avoid war at all costs. It's the same reason why, parents might say like, "Oh, I wish you'd be on time." They're trying to avoid a fight with you. Sometimes it's easier to just let them get what they want than it is to like go to war. In 1938, he tests them again with invading the Sudetenland. This is a tiny strip of land in Czechoslovakia. I have a map on the next slide that I'll show you. Most of them are German speaking, but remember after World War I, they divided up the map of Europe. They broke up the German Empire, Germany, kind of like a German empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They took some land from Russia, and they kind of created the self-determination of nations. Well, Germany wants their land back. They want Poland back. They want the Sudetenland back. To maintain peace, Britain and France, and FDR kind of says, yeah, that sounds good with me, met with Hitler and Mussolini in Munich, and basically said, okay, you can have the Sudetenland, but that's it. You need to stop these acts of aggression. And Hitler, you can imagine, kind of like laughing at me, like, okay, whatever you say. So here you can see the Sudetenland. It's just this tiny strip all the way around Czechoslovakia. Most people there do speak German. This is a really good political cartoon because you can see, right, the spineless leaders of democracy and the stepping stones of glory. And that Hitler, right, they're all bending over. They're just letting him do whatever he wants. And he's mocking them. He's like, they're not going to do anything about it. That's how I want you to kind of remember that. Okay, so Munich Pact, those Western powers allow Hitler to take over the Sudetenland. So after Japan invades more of China in 1937, he starts to see a trend, and he's a little bit worried about it. And so he starts to kind of make it known. And so the first thing he does is he gives his quarantine speech. And it says that democracies should be acting together to quarantine aggressive governments. So I don't mean the quarantine like what we're going through right now. I mean, hey, we shouldn't be doing business with these guys. We need to kind of isolate them. Public opinion was down. They were like, why are you talking about this? We don't care, right? We want nothing to do with it. Don't worry about it. But also, like President Wilson during World War I, FDR is saying, all right, listen, we're neutral for sure, but we need to start getting ready. What if they come after us? And so preparedness, which we talked about in World War I, FDR encourages Congress to increase military spending. So they increased those budgets by 2/3 in 1938. Some isolationists are like, okay, that's fine, just in case, right? And so you kind of get a little bit, people are moving a little bit towards that side of like, we need to be prepared in case something happens. Now, the big deal here is 1939. Hitler breaks that Munich Pact or the Munich Agreement. You can see that either way, and invades all of Czechoslovakia. Britain and France pledged to fight Germany just in case they invade Poland, which we knew that if they're going to invade Czechoslovakia, they're going to want to do that with Poland. Hitler, the Nazis, hated the idea of Poland having their sovereignty. They believed the Polish people were inferior, which is why a lot of Polish people are going to be put in concentration camps or work camps during the Holocaust. They believed that the Soviet Union would help since communism and fascism were ideological enemies. That turned out not to be the case. In 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union formed the Non-Aggression Pact, and they secretly pledged to divide Poland between them. So the Soviet Union was also upset at some of the results of Versailles. Remember that they didn't play a role in that. And so you'll probably see this image in your head now when you think of the Non-Aggression Pact between the two. But here's Joseph Stalin, right? And Hitler on their wedding day. Isn't that precious? And so on September of 1939, Blitzkrieg, so lightning war, German tanks and planes launch an attack on Poland so quickly that they didn't really there was hardly any resistance at all. Britain and France declare war on Germany and all the Axis powers. By spring of 1940, so within 5, 6 months, Germany attacks all those Scandinavian countries, Finland and Norway, Sweden. They surrender within a few days, and then France within a week. By June of 1940, all that remained free of German troops was Great Britain, and this is a really big deal. They have the coast of France. That's where later we'll have the D-Day invasion. And FDR is worried, right? So with this map, you can see how quickly German occupation lasted. Now, eventually what will happen is Germany will attack the Soviet Union, and that's how the Soviet Union will partner with the United States. And it wasn't because it's like, oh yeah, we're BFFs. It's because we had a common enemy. And that was kind of what the Soviet Union was doing with Germany as well, as their common enemy was Poland. Okay, so the US policy is going to change a little bit. It's going to start to shift, right? So before we had the Neutrality Acts, now Germany is dominating Europe, and it's alarming a lot of Americans. What if we're next? And you're going to see a lot of the propaganda that kind of connects to that. FDR believes that Britain's survival is crucial for US security. And so they start to chip away at the Neutrality Acts. And the first way that they do this is the cash and carry policy. Britain has control of the seas, right? So they've got that outstanding navy. The US did away with their arms embargo, and so they start to sell weapons to Britain, well, to any nation, okay, let's be clear, to any nation as long as they pay cash. So we're not going to go into debt over this, we're not going to loan any money out, and if they carry them on their own ships. So we are helping Britain in particular versus Germany because of their navy and how they're controlling the seas. And we knew that when we did it, this was going to help. Now, this cartoon, something might look a little bit familiar to it. So before Dr. Seuss wrote children's books and was celebrated by children all over the world, even today, he was a political cartoonist. And so this was one of his cartoons, The Old Man of the Sea. Aid that will win. So again, we're not going to go into debt over this. We're going to, as long as you pay cash and you come and get them, like we're going to sell you, because that's going to also help our economy. And that's how we got Republican isolationists kind of on board. The Selective Service Act is reissued, and all American men are registered to for the draft. 1.2 million troops in 1 year were trained. And again, what's interesting about this is that they issued the Selective Service Act before war was declared. That is unprecedented. But I think people were starting to kind of get scared. And so most of them were for it. Now, the next thing is Britain is really struggling with constant air raids. In the fall of 1940, submarines are threatening British control of the Atlantic. FDR decides to negotiate a trade. Britain got 50 destroyers, right? So they need some more ships. And in return, the US can build bases on the British Isles in the Caribbean. And so we're just trying to figure out a way how we can help them, but also get around Congress a little bit. And so we give them some ships that we had built up during American imperialism, and the payout, because they couldn't pay us in cash, was bases that we could build later on. Now, a lot of people always say, like, why did FDR run for a third term? It was unprecedented. And a lot of it has to do with timing. So all of this is going on, and the 1940 election comes around. And the basic thought that FDR, like his justification was, because he's a little bit older. His main thing was he didn't really trust anyone else to do it, and also that major shift in leadership. He was worried that it would result in the U.S. entering the war without a strong leader, and he didn't want to do that. And so he sought re-election within the Democratic Party. He was extremely popular within the Democratic Party, and it was because of this critical time, right? His Republican opponent was Wendell Willkie. That's probably why Wendell Willkie lost, really, is because of his name. That's a joke. It's not the same without you here, kids. He had openly criticized the New Deal, largely agreed with the idea of preparedness and aiding Britain. And And the only criticism that he had, like, imagine, these ads that come on TV moving close to the election. His only criticism was he shouldn't be running for a third term. That's not all that great. Now, he won the popular vote by 54%. That's a pretty small margin if you think about it. I mean, that's kinda closer to what we're seeing, in elections today. Important factors for why he was reelected is economic recovery had enhanced kind of some of these defense purchases. That fear of war, voters again wanted to stay with an experienced leader, and so, that is why he ran for that third term, and that is why he won. Now, in one of his 1940 fireside chats, he said, "We must be a great arsenal of democracy." And basically, what he is trying to convince people is that we need to be producing. We don't have to go and fight, but what we need to be producing all of the arms and the kind of like using our industry to help the Allied powers defeat Hitler because that's how worried they were about him. Um, he starts to propose lending money to Britain instead of just having them pay in cash because they've run out of cash. So the Lend-Lease Act will be in March of 1941. And it says, in a nutshell, so you don't have to pay in cash anymore. Whatever you need, you can have it. Credit, doesn't matter. We'll settle up later. What do you need? Here you go. He is also arguing about, he uses the Four Freedoms speech. This is one of his most famous speeches about how this is what we have here in the United States, right? Ours to fight for. Norman Rockwell, you've probably heard of that artist before. He painted these paintings that are over here to the right. Freedom of speech, worship, freedom from want, meaning like in the United States of America, we don't just have our basic needs met. We are able to fulfill our wants. Like you can give your family anything anything that they want and desire. That's not something that other countries have, especially in these totalitarian um, led nations. And freedom from fear. This is a big one, right? Like, look at what's happening in Europe. This could happen here. We need to be more aggressive. And that really, this is kind of like a PR, a public relations type speech where he's trying to put it in people's minds that what's going on in Europe is scary. And he wants us to kind of use that, kind of think of it as like moral diplomacy, I guess, to a certain extent, and try to imagine if these freedoms were taken from us. So here they are a little bit closer. They turn them into different posters, okay, that you would see to sell bonds and things like that. Okay, so now the United States is actively aiding Britain. We need to be that great arsenal of democracy. And so FDR meets with Churchill off the coast of Newfoundland, and they talk about after the war, right? We haven't even joined the war, but they're talking about this idea of self-determination for people, no more territorial expansion, free trade. And FDR orders the United States to escort British ships carrying those Lend-Lease materials. So now we do have U.S. soldiers that are aiding Britain. I also know that during this time period, some of our pilots are going over and helping the British pilots, their Royal Air Force. In September, a U.S. destroyer is attacked by a German submarine, and so from that point on, FDR uses or orders the Navy to shoot on sight, so we can actually engage the German U-boats. Okay, now in Japan, FDR responds to Japan when they join the Axis powers. He prohibits the export of steel, any type of scrap iron, to all countries except for Britain and nations within the Western Hemisphere. And so this does affect Japan dramatically. It's really aimed at Japan. They know it's aimed at them. They call it an unfriendly act. And in 1941, Japan then decides to occupy French Indochina. So French Indochina today, if you're trying to kind of get your bearings, that's going to be Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. And so after that, FDR says, okay, we're going to cut off all access to credit. So where I guess investors had been investing with Japanese, so that all of that is gone now, but in particular, U.S. oil. And this is what struck struck a chord, is that they desperately needed that oil in order to keep their war going, right? They're using it for the ships, for within the factories, all of that. And so in October, or by October, we had a series of negotiations with Japan. They'd gone back and forth over, they basically still want the oil. The United States wants Japan to completely withdraw from China and French Indochina, and Japan refused, and that was kind of the end of it. And then we have the day that will live in infamy. Sunday, December 7th, 1941, Japanese planes leave an aircraft carrier and they fly over Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor is a naval base in Hawaii, and they bomb every ship and airfield that they could find. And it basically, there were 3 different waves or 3 different phases of the attack. It lasted in all over a little less than 2 hours. It killed over 2,400 Americans, 1,200 were wounded. 20 warships were sunk or severely damaged, and approximately 150 airplanes were destroyed. Now, the U.S. had broken some Japanese codes within hours beforehand, and they knew that there was an attack that was imminent. They knew that the Japanese embassy was beginning to destroy, or had been ordered to destroy any type of sensitive documents and start evacuating. They didn't know where it was. A lot of people thought maybe the Philippines, because that's a little bit closer to them. And we also weren't aware of the Japanese sophistication in their technology with their planes, right? So the biggest thing you have to imagine, and I wish this is where I was one of those times where I wish I was in front of you guys. So you use aircraft carriers, right, to get close to something, and then planes take off from those ships. So their ships were called Zeros, right? And the thing is you have to get your aircraft carriers close enough to your target where the planes can not only make it there, but then also make it back to the aircraft carrier. And you have to do that without getting detected. Now, we didn't really have the technology and within our airplanes to be able to get within 300 miles. I think they were within 300 miles because they should have been detected. Radar is very early technology at this point in time. It really wasn't that trustworthy. And so a lot of people say, like, how do we not see, hundreds of planes coming, or how did we not see these Japanese fleets moving? Well, it's a big ocean, and the technology just wasn't there yet. Now, why would the Japanese do this? Why would they sleep the waking bear? Their goal was to dominate the the Pacific, the Pacific Ocean, right? So, and because the United States had a presence in the Philippines, they had a presence in like Midway and Guam, they knew that they couldn't do that with the United States present. And so if they attacked the U.S. Pacific Fleet, right, they could kind of give them a head start. And that's exactly what happened. We'll talk more about that in the next video. So FDR addresses Congress the next day. And he basically asked for a declaration of war. Congress gives it to him. Germany and Italy declare war on the United States. And by June of 1941, Germany had already broken the pact with the Soviet Union. So now we're going to have an alliance between the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and the United States. And they're going to be known as the Big Three. Their strategy early on is to focus on Europe before Japan. And it's going to be Europe first strategy. They believe that even though Japan attacked us, we believe that Hitler is the greater threat in all of this compared to the Japanese. And that will be it for today's video. You can tune in to the next video where we will be talking about how World War II affected the home front.